possibilist is someone who believes that anything is possible and they go for it.
Not changing is just not an option.
I believe in change. I am a possibilist.
Welcome to the launch of the 2023 Possibilists Report, and wishing a blessed Eid to our Muslim viewers today. From climate change to racial justice, young changemakers, as we know, across the world are rallying for a just, sustainable, and equitable future. Often pioneers in their sector, these young and ambitious entrepreneurs and activists are applying fresh ways of thinking to some of the world's most pressing problems. Through the first Possibilists Report in 2021, it became very clear. Young changemakers create amazing, impressive, and inspiring impact, but they struggle. 2 years later, in 2023, we have some updates for you. Some, to be honest, quite shocking, some very positive. Together with my colleagues Miriam and Mubarak, it is my great honor to welcome you all today to the launch of the 2023 report. We, as representatives of the support global ecosystem, realized beyond all of our individual activities and support programs, if we wanted to truly tackle the challenges that young changemakers face, we can only do that through collaboration. Initiated by Changemaker Exchange, the Possibilists Alliance today is 20 of the world's largest social innovation networks, including Ashoka and Actors, Kofi Annan Foundation, Global Changemakers, We Are Family Foundation, and many, many more. To ensure the diversity in the data in 2023, and in an effort to represent even more and as many voices of young people from all kinds of backgrounds as possible, in 2023, we also invited over 50 local and regional organizations from every part of the world to be a part and join us in this global effort. Our vision really is that of a global ecosystem that is aligned by a shared data-driven understanding of the real needs that young changemakers have, and thereby creating the best possible conditions for their initiatives and themselves to thrive. And we really couldn't be more pleased and happy to have some absolutely awesome partners on board for this, including the Vienna University of Economics and Business as our academic partner, Google.org and SAP as supporters, as well as Berlin-based Rainbow Unicorn for all things design and visual identity. And as you'll see at the end of the presentation, we've got some beautiful assets and websites and materials for you. Before we jump into the 2023 report, we'd love to take a quick look back and share some of the actions that we've taken in response to the insights from the 2021 report. Miriam from the Changemaker Exchange team, over to you.
And so, as Matthias mentioned, over the past 18 months, we've seen many support organizations, funders, and changemakers that took actions that were informed by both the data and insights in the 2021 report. So one of the key needs that were expressed by young changemakers in the 2021 study was more access to grant making, capacity building, and support programs. And in response, our alliance collectively launched the Possibilists Directory, a freely accessible and growing repository of offers from more than 600 support organizations from all around the world, which we'll give you a quick overview now in a video. That video always hits me right in the feels. But if you haven't checked out the directory, make sure to do so on the Possibilists website. But beyond these collective efforts as well, we saw many funders and support organizations step up individually too, citing that these new approaches were heavily informed by the 2021 findings. So we've seen the introduction of new major funds like the €20 million Social Innovation Fund by Google.org, or the doubling down on skills and capacity building by programs by folks like SAP, and the introduction of well-being across many, many different types of organizations. Even changemakers themselves from all around the world have told us how helpful the report was for them, citing, it helped them feel less lonely on their change-making journey, or it opened their eyes to the importance of well-being. Others also said that it helped them advocate for more support for themselves, and it prompted a mindset shift that changed their idea on the fact that, changing things for the better isn't always their individual responsibility. It's actually the responsibility of the entire ecosystem. So we were blown away by the impact of the first report, and we are hoping that the 2023 iteration can bring new insights and help to create the best conditions in the ecosystem to help changemakers thrive. And now on to the juicy bit, which we're all here for, the 2023 report. The study went live on the 13th of February and it closed on March 26th. Participants were sourced via an open call on social media, as well as through the networks of the Possibilists Alliance members and the network partners. We reached 1,656 changemakers from across 133 countries. And 1,160 of those were beyond idea stage, which is the sample that we are focusing on to produce these findings today. To give you an idea of some of the demographics, 48.5% of respondents were female and 48.1% were male. 1.7% identified themselves as non-binary, and 1.2% preferred not to disclose their gender at all. 38% of respondents self-identified themselves as marginalized, and amongst those who did identify themselves as such, the most common identifiers were coming from a rural or underserved community, being economically disadvantaged, being of Indigenous background, facing racial discrimination, or coming from a religious group, having a migration background, or having a disability or other health-related issue, as well as being part of the LGBTQIA+ community. And now I'm going to hand over to Mubarak, my colleague, who will help us get a better picture of the kind of changemakers who responded.
Thank you, Miriam. At the Possibilists, we believe young people play a particularly important role in the transition to a social and green economy. For one, they are typically the ones most heavily affected, whether it is by the pandemic, youth unemployment, or the climate crisis. At the same time, youth is a demographic that creates an amazing amount of tangible solutions to our shared challenges. They hold industry leaders and people in power accountable and build critical masses like never in history. The young changemakers surveyed are working across the SDGs, with every single one being addressed. When asked to think about their work within the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals framework, the three main focus areas are tackling some of the most pressing issues that affect all of humanity. Number one is quality education, which stands at 39.2%, closely followed by climate action, 30.9%, and gender equality was at the third with 25.3%. It'll interest you to know that SDG 13, which is climate action, has risen by an astounding 21% since the 2021 study, and is now the second key focus area, replacing SDG 10, which is reduced inequalities. This highlights the high level of urgency that young changemakers feel around climate action. Now, when asked about the top three motivators about their work, 94.8% want to mobilize and empower others, whether it be youth or specific target groups for changemaking. 92.2% want to contribute to pressing global issues, whether it is climate change or rising inequality because of the level of urgency. And 91.5% want to do something for the community they come from or live in. It is now my great pleasure to welcome four wonderful changemakers from across the world to share with us a bit more about their work and the impact they create. Tanzila Khan is a globally renowned activist for disability rights. Lauren Castelino is the founder at Green Career Center and the co-director at Regenesis. Mantaro Garcia Medellin is the founder and chairman at Juventud Unida, and Charles Falajiki as the chief development officer at Aid for Rural Education Access Initiative, Area I. Throughout the presentation of the report, we'd love to bring in their voices at various points. Tanzila, I'd like to bring you to the floor. Can you please share with us a bit about the work you do as a changemaker? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mubarak, and hello and assalamu alaikum and Eid Mubarak to everybody. So since I'm a person with disability myself, much of my work is inspired from the challenges that I face. And first of all, I work in menstrual healthcare. I deliver menstrual products to menstruators in Pakistan. And now I've also started a board game that educates non-disabled people about disability. So these are the two domains that I'm currently working in.
Thank you so much for sharing, Tanzila. Mantaro, can you tell us more about your work as the founder and chairman at Juventud Unida? Thank you.
Thank you too. Hi everyone, Mantaro Garcia over here. Basically, Juventud Unida, or United Youth in English, is an NGO which is basically a conglomerate of different peace culture initiatives. We started as in violence prevention initiative, specifically school violence, which is more commonly referred as bullying specifically. And later on, after creating law initiatives in our home state, which is Nuevo León, particularly here, Monterrey, Nuevo León, later on it was approved. And later on, we also constituted itself legally as a non-profit, non-governmental organization. Now, fast forward to today, and we are basically this conglomerate of different peace culture initiatives based on precisely on climate action, for example, migration, youth employment, dignified work opportunities, and as well, our main goal since the beginning, youth violence prevention. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing, Mantaro. And Lauren, you are the founder at Green Career Center and the co-director at Regenesis. Can you tell us more about the impact you're creating through these ventures? Thank you.
Of course. So hi, everyone. It's so exciting to be here. My name is Lauren, and I'm based out of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So as mentioned, I'm the founder of the Green Career Center, and our mission is to prepare underrepresented youth, including BIPOC, newcomers, and women, for green careers. We do everything, including hosting green career events, conducting innovative and participatory research, and developing useful and impactful resources. I also work at Regenesis, and we're a community environmental organization. We do everything ranging from food justice, cycling, circular economy, and champion environmental education.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much. And Charles, you are the Chief Development Officer at Aid for Rural Education Access Initiative. I'd like you to tell us more about your work as a change maker and the work you do for Area I. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Charles, and I work with Aid for Rural Education Access Initiative. And from the name, we focus primarily on improving educational access for children living in conflict-affected contexts, rural communities, and marginalized homes. And the bulk of my work that I do in Area I focus primarily on improving foundational skills development for children, on improving girls' education, on improving digital equity, and fourthly, on improving the transition from school to work. How do we enable and support young people and youth to make the easy transition from school to work by acquiring the foundational and functional skills, particularly digital skills that have become very significant in today's digital economy. And over the last 7 years, we've been able to support over 75,000 beneficiaries across Nigeria states, particularly in 16 states across Nigeria. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing. I'll now pass the mic over to Miriam.
Thanks, Mubarak, and thank you to all of our speakers as well. So grateful to have you here sharing about your work and your personal experiences of change makers, of change making, because at the end of the day, it's folks like you who are at the heart of the work that the Possibilists is doing. And we'll hear from the speakers again in just a moment after we dig into some of the challenges that were surfaced from the 2023 report. So we are here, of course, to rightly celebrate the impact of young innovators and activists, and to take inspiration from that impact as well. But as we will show in a moment, change-making as a path is not all that easy, and it is time to act to try and change the conditions to make it a little bit easier on these change makers. But before we turn our attention to the challenging bits, we want to start with something that's just a little bit positive. So interestingly, despite the fact that there are many challenges, hardships, and uncertainties that change makers face in their daily lives, their life satisfaction is actually strikingly high. So on a scale of 0 to 10, they rank in at a 7. And this is considerably higher than the global average of 5.6 as per the Global Happiness Index. In fact, if changemakers were a country, they would rank 14th in the world out of 96 countries that were surveyed. That would be between Lauren's hometown of Canada and my hometown of Ireland, my home country of Ireland. So perhaps, I don't know, working in line with their purpose and values and pursuing a passion as a career plays a large role in their overall life satisfaction. I mean, I know it does in mine. So moving on to the challenges then, although, you know, overall life satisfaction is relatively high in changemakers, it doesn't mean that it's an easy road. Less than 1 in 10 young social innovators can live off their social change ventures. Only 6.4% of all young changemakers can cover all their necessary expenses through their initiatives work. This is almost 3% less than in 2021, meaning their financial situation has actually worsened. Around 8 out of 10 young changemakers can only cover half or less than half of their necessary income through the work on their initiatives, meaning that they must look elsewhere for financial compensation and security. And 70% of them say that a lack of financial personal security is a key hurdle for them and their teams. Also, women are less likely to be able to remunerate themselves than men, and respondents who identify as marginalized are significantly less likely to be able to compensate themselves compared to non-marginalized counterparts. Age also plays a role. The older in age you are, the more likely you are to receive compensation. And the same goes for education. The higher their educational degree, the more likely they are to receive compensation. 78% of respondents also have other professional commitments like a job or studying in addition to working on their initiatives. And when we asked changemakers what makes it most difficult for you personally to successfully work on your initiatives, 47% of them responded that it was a lack of important or powerful or relevant connections. And finally, the fourth challenge is around burnout and well-being issues. So 1 in 4, or 26.4% of changemakers in the study are experiencing some form of burnout. These numbers have actually significantly improved since 2021, when 59% of social innovators in the Possibilists Study reported having different degrees of burnout since they had started working on their initiative. And we think that this might actually reflect the overall increase in well-being after the burdens of the pandemic. But in qualitative interviews, follow-up interviews, some respondents in the 2021 report said that that report was actually an alarm bell to help them prioritize their mental health and also prevent burnout. However, we should still, take this improvement with a grain of salt, because 56% of respondents in the 2023 study do mention a high risk of burnout as a key obstacle that makes it difficult for them to thrive and deepen their impact. And after all, 1 in 4 experiencing burnout is still 1 in 4 too many. Also, women and those belonging to marginalized groups continue to report higher levels of burnout than those who do not identify as marginalized. And on that topic of marginalization, those who self-identify as marginalized face more obstacles on average, is a finding that we have taken from the 2023 report. So there's an average number of reported blockers of 3.39 for those who identify as marginalized, compared to those who don't identify as marginalized, which is at 2.6.
As we've just heard from Miriam, young changemakers tackle some of the world's most pressing challenges, but the conditions in the ecosystem makes it difficult for them and their teams to thrive and to deepen or scale their impact. I'd love to bring back the voices of our guest changemakers now to share with us how these results resonate with their own lived experiences. To start, I would like to start with Charles here. Can you, just give us your high-level impression? Do these results surprise you, and what sticks out for you? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mubarak. I mean, it's quite interesting that the report actually, I could relate with the contextual reality, right, of what changemakers represented in the report, right, particularly from, the lack of personal financing, right, to sustain their own, life, as well as the impact they're making, right. And at the peak of that is the fact that most organizations do not want to, fund early stage social entrepreneurs, right, that are working to improve or to combat climate change or education, right? But thankfully, for the kind of work that organizations such as Global Changemakers does, they're able to now provide, some level of financing for early stage changemakers, right, to, promote the work they do, basically, right? Another thing that I think I really related with, particularly in the report, is burnout, right? As social entrepreneurs that are passionate about changing the world and, redirecting human history, right, to ensure that we all live in harmony, promoting peace, sustainable development, climate sustainability, education, and prosperity for all, right? There is this zeal that comes with the kind of work that we do. And, most time we probably forget that we need to take some rest. And, also trying to juggle between different responsibility, probably between other work to sustain income or probably academic work to gain money to promote the work you do. There's this high level of burnout that, social change makers experience, like myself, I mean. So it's quite interesting to see that I'm not alone, right? So the report actually captures what I think is the lived realities, right, of social change makers. And I also want to, see that, I mean, it's quite also important to highlight the positive part, which is some sort of self-fulfillment or life fulfillment that comes from the kind of work that we do. And that also reflects in the report as well, because as a change maker myself, and which I could say as other change makers on those call, right? The fact that we're able to work and promote the things that we believe in, right? It gives us some sort of sense of accomplishment or happiness that okay, we're doing something right to probably help people face the challenges that we've faced before, or raise significant awareness around problems that are challenging people from the kind of society that we come from. So I think the report actually represents the reality of change makers like myself. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Charles. You touched base on so important topics and more on financial insecurity and also burnout. I'd like to go to you next, Lauren. From the report, we can see that there's been a significant drop in the number of change makers who report having experienced burnout. Does that align with your observation of fellow change makers? Thank you.
I was actually quite surprised that there was a dropout in the number of change makers who have been experiencing burnout. Because personally, I find this really hard to believe, just given the cost of living in Toronto is very expensive, with food prices going up and housing prices soaring. I just find that change making is increasingly seeming to become more and more out of reach for young people. But I've also noticed that as a result of COVID-19 restrictions lessening, change makers do have more avenues to build communities. And I know I personally really benefited from having more in-person interactions and events and just overall feeling more connected to others. I know this past weekend I actually hosted an event focused on professional development for change makers and other underrepresented youth. We were giving out free LinkedIn headshots, which was just a really great opportunity to network, help other fellow community members from low income and marginalized backgrounds, just really have that community of support.
Oh, thank you for sharing, Lauren. And I'd like to go to Mantaro next. Do you think there's another reality, beyond the data that was presented that you'd actually like to bring to this space? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Part of the importance of this data actually revolves around that we have a concrete number to show the realities that many change makers are facing all around the world. For example, here in Mexico, it's actually quite hard to get some data related to social impact, specifically from young change makers. So this report actually is very enlightening for us to see that, I don't know if it's a good or bad thing, but that actually we are very similar in the challenges that the world is facing. For example, I want to bring in light the burnout situation. Perhaps here in Mexico, it has been a little bit more severe. Specifically, in here, I quote, at least on my home city, which is Monterrey, Nuevo León, I've been involved with several other change makers in here locally, and everyone raises an alarm on burnout and even other mental health issues, not just burnout, which is also very important to notice. And this burnout is also happening very similar, like in people in here already told, which is there is a lot of financial insecurities. There is a lot of life expectancies that it's difficult to accomplish right now. For example, in many metropolitan areas, the rent prices, the housing prices are directly impacting the lives of many people all around the world. And it's not just a problem of specific countries, but I believe in many other countries it's happening. Or the fact that, for example, the utility prices are rising up also in many parts of the world. So whether if you do not live in a metropolitan area and your change making, for example, is happening on a rural area, you have the hurdle to sustain the rising utility prices, for example. Also, we have found out that there is these barriers of entry for change makers. For example, if you want to be a change maker and create an NGO or a nonprofit or a social entrepreneurship or anything related, you need to constitute it legally. You need to pay for that legal constitution. You need to pay for the administrative processes to the government. You need to pay taxes. You need to pay several things. And this financial hurdle is actually a barrier of entry, because how many people and how many youths out there actually have the creativity and that huge potential for change, but the barrier of entry is just there. And I think also later on this report will also try to bring down the barrier to, for our policymakers, for our lawmakers, for authorities, and even for the corporate world to know the actual realities that the youth is facing currently.
Thank you so much for sharing, Mantaro. You actually shed light on a lot of important barriers that young change makers face, specifically given more information about the change makers that you interface with. Tanzila, I'd like to ask, what's the most striking part of this report for you?
Well, I can say that the numbers are a delight to understand that a lot of people experience the same thing that I did when I started my journey, which was a couple of years ago. And for me, it was a double-edged sword, because living with a physical disability in Pakistan, you have a lot of physical barriers. Not a lot of buildings are accessible to get a regular job. So I think I was literally thrown into this ocean of accident, and then naturally I try to overcome the barriers that I face as a person in a wheelchair, and I saw a lot of other people were facing, and of course their caregivers as well. So, but in this whole area, even as a young change maker, the cause that I stand up for is highly tokenized. So sometimes you don't get selected for good ideas, especially if they have a business model. I was unable to give myself a salary for a very long time. So I felt the doors were shut on me on many levels. In terms of creativity, like my fellow panelists mentioned, and even in terms of monetizing the work that I was trying to do. And then, of course, a disability is still stigmatized in many countries. So you have to cut through many different barriers to actually reach the core of the problem. But I think as young change makers, we not just face the struggle of finances, we also face the struggle of missing life events and emotion and time with our friends. But there's one particular fact that I really liked was the happiness index, and I completely agree with that. I never thought that would come to the surface, but that's true. That we take good change making as a lifestyle, and it's extremely rewarding in the heart of the soul, because we know we're contributing to something that we might not see in this lifetime, but it is wholesome, it is for future generations, and it feels great to be a part of it.
Yes, change makers are happy people. Thank you so much for sharing, Tanzila. And thank you all so much. And we'll get back to you again in just a moment when speaking about recommendations for actions we can all take. Back to you, Miriam.
Thanks, Mubarak. And so, yeah, beyond the challenges that we presented earlier, we just now want to bring a spotlight to one particularly striking statistic from the study, and that's around climate anxiety. So 82.3% of respondents said that they are very or extremely worried about climate change. Climate anxiety is negatively affecting them personally and their work. 53.5% of them said that their feeling around climate change, which are feelings of anxiety, fear, anger, and frustration, are negatively affecting their daily lives. And this can also lead to lower well-being all around, depression and other forms of mental suffering. But as the saying goes, every cloud does have a silver lining. And I think we can acknowledge that anxiety and anger can also be powerful motivators for climate action. And perhaps that's demonstrated by the fact that the climate action has become the second largest area that changemakers are now working on, as Mubarak mentioned earlier. And so we feel that we cannot separate the well-being of young changemakers from the well-being of planet, and that we see the need for rapid, progressive climate action as a key action point for the change-making ecosystem coming out of this report.
Thank you, Miriam. We've learned about the impact and the challenges that young change makers face all around the world. And thank you again to this wonderful panel of awesome speakers to share their own lived experience with us. We now want to quickly bring to everyone's attention their needs, which we've also surveyed in the Possibilists Study. And if you feel a little overwhelmed by this slide, Well, that's in fact the message. There isn't really just any one specific need, but changemakers consider so many things as important at the same time, and I can tell you the list even goes on further than those here on this slide, including things like improving how they can collaborate with others, ensuring the quality of their products or services, access to relevant networks, skills building, visibility, access to new target groups, and so much more. So there's really enough work here for everyone and every support network, funder, and anyone supporting young changemakers out there. While a really much smaller percentage of people in the data sample consider this important or very important, we think it's very critical to acknowledge that 59% of the changemakers surveyed in the study consider basic security for their staff or themselves, for example, shelter, food, water, and heating, to be important or very important. And we feel this is really critical to bring to everyone's attention, because it is sometimes something that we may overlook, that it does start with the very basic needs sometimes, and not just the skills building and the more classic needs that changemakers may have. We rightly celebrate the impact that young changemakers are creating, and we're taking inspiration from it. But as we've seen and have heard multiple times throughout this presentation, the path that they choose and chose for the good of all of us at the end of the day is really not easy at all. There is two organizations and many more, but two in particular, who've really been at the forefront of supporting changemakers and support organizations around the world. And those are SAP and Google.org, both partners long-term for the Possibilists. I'd love to now use the chance to invite to the virtual stage with me Alexandra van der Ploeg, the Global Head of Corporate Social Responsibility at SAP, and Rowan Barnett, the Director of Google.org in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And if I may say, great friends now for many, many years that support all the work that we do around the Possibilists and above and beyond. Alex and Rowan, please tell us a little bit about why SAP and Google have chosen social entrepreneurship and supporting young innovators and innovators in general as sort of a key focus of your corporate giving and your citizenship strategies, and why maybe you think the Possibilists is critical for this ecosystem.
All right, shall I go first, Rowan?
Go ahead.
Good.
Thank you.
Good seeing you again, by the way. Thank you so much for having me here, Matthias. I think, SAP has been working in this space for a good 13, 14 years, basically working with the social enterprise sector. And I actually want to make one small correction from what you said, because working with the social enterprise sector isn't just part of our corporate citizenship and corporate giving strategy. It's actually part of our business strategy. And I think that's a key differentiation, because everything that we're trying to do with the social enterprise sector, with social innovators and with young social innovators, is to enable and facilitate business partnerships between the private sector and the social enterprise sector. And the reason why we believe that this is so important is because that we see that social innovators are truly at the forefront and creating best-in-class examples of what it means to balance out people, planet, and profit. And believe me, these are things that the private sector struggles with, right? There's a lot of demands on the private sector to create that balance. But frankly, the ones who are living it, who are showing us how it should be done and how it needs to be done, are the social innovators in the world. So, we're sort of using them as sort of a best in class and as an exemplar for us and a role model for us in terms of the direction that we as a company should be moving into. Just one or two sentences on why I think, the Possibilists Study is so incredibly important. And maybe just sharing an example from SAP. Data is everything. And Rowan will probably share that opinion, because otherwise you're basing decisions that you're making on anecdotes, on hearsay. And if you have data and you have facts, you actually have a really solid foundation on which to design entire strategies and long-term plans. And I can share later on how we've been using the Possibilists Study for that. But it's absolutely essential, I think, for the private sector, for the public sector, and particularly also for governments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Rowan, any thoughts your end? Same question.
Thanks, Matthias, and hi everyone. Look, I mean, I think Alexandra touched on a lot of, exactly the same, right considerations, same considerations that we've had, and the way we kind of think about this. I mean, SAP, as Alexandra said, have been in this space for a long time, really supporting the social sector. And we've been for a long time supporting social enterprises, but it's been the last few years we started to look more at that sector as a whole in the ecosystem, and how can we help as a philanthropy. And I think, similarly, we were coming at the angle that, we have all these huge crises, climate, pandemics, migration, just to name a few, and to tackle these successively in order to create these more resilient economies, inclusive, sustainable, and societies, that requires deep social innovation, and it requires that kind of mindset shift as well. I think to Alexandra's point, businesses putting people purpose at the center of their core goals. Now, social entrepreneurs, obviously, really critical role there in both addressing some of those solutions, but also contributing to that social and purpose-driven mindset shift. So again, that's also the context that we started looking at. Okay, how could we help the social economy, social entrepreneurs, change makers at that kind of ecosystem level? And yeah, starting out, had a lot of the kind of questions of how do we enable more great change makers like Tanzila, Mantaro, Charles, Laura, that we just heard from. What are the barriers they face? What are the needs? And again, Possibilists super helpful, as can only underscore, as Alexandra thought I would. Data is key, and not just data for funders, of course, data for policymakers, data support organizations. Everyone should make those informed decisions, just where we channel our energy, where we channel our resources. So also really happy to see you come up with a key set of key recommendations in the new report on for those three kind of stakeholder groups.
Yeah, thank you. Awesome. Alex, Rowan, maybe a quick round before we take a little peek into the future. Are there particular data points that resonate more or less with you, that stick out, that you were thinking, oh, wow, didn't expect that, or a confirmation of something that you already knew? What are sort of maybe one or two of the data points that touched you the most?
Yeah, so I think maybe I'll pick up one, and it's the data point on lack of access to the right kind of people, right, and building networks. And the reason why I'm picking that one is because we actually designed a whole strategy around that. When we saw that figure pop up the first time in the 2021 study, and now reinforced again in the 2023 study, we realized we actually can do something about this. If there's one thing that SAP is really good at, it's building networks, it's bringing people together, it's connecting the dots and building ecosystems. So one of the things that we have done is, based on the data from the Possibilists, we have been looking at, how can we provide access to young people, to decision makers at big events. For example, in Davos at the World Economic Forum, or during United Nations General Assembly Week in September, or at COP28 in Dubai in November, where we'll bring young change makers to these events and meet them up, make sure that they can meet up with important people for their networks, be it, in politics, in governments, in the private sector, to enhance their networks, but also to give them access to resources that they need. So this is just one that really, really resonated with us, and that sort of informed part of our strategy.
Wonderful. Rowan, what stuck out for you?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of different and great insights in the report. I think Miriam talked about the data on the financial situation. 1 in 10 young social innovators not being able to live off their ventures, half not being able to compensate themselves. And I think that obviously really just reinforces that need to open up more funding in the sector for social. I mean, actually, that was an impulse we also took from your first report, and actually where we generally have been supporting social enterprise at a much higher funding level. And that was one where we also had started a 2-track kind of funding and accelerator, which also started at up to 10,000. So because of that, that need just to cover some of that basic overheads as you're building out an idea, as you're getting something started. And so that was definitely an impulse, I think, from the first report to start some earlier stage funding and not just open it up for those at a little bit later stage. But yeah, look, there's a lot to be done in changing the funding landscape. It's easier said than done, given the criteria of the startup impact investment sector. I think we certainly, would hope that a lot more funders, we can get more funders, corporate funders into the space, come alongside SAP and ourselves. And, I think we also need to do more on educating young change makers on how to create strong business models. I think you mentioned that as folks got older, they seem to have slightly less issues in getting capital. And, that's in part just the experience and how do you build effective social enterprises, tap into new revenue streams. So that I saw, 90% identified skills and training as a need. So I think that's something as well, where it doesn't just have to be cash funding. There's a clear need there that funders can kind of go in and bring the resources they have. And then, finally, I think, as I mentioned, I think the recommendations you've laid out there for funders as well really resonated. I think, flexible funding, super important. Covering overheads, multi-year funding local organizations as well. And also as a funder focusing on burnout, actually, and having taken that as a critical insight and putting it into your programs that you're running to support change makers.
Yeah, wonderful. I feel like Alex and Rowan, you both touched a little on things that you're already doing. Maybe in 2 or 3 sentences, the one activity or support that you are planning in the future that you're really excited about, just 20 seconds each for a final little brief outlook into the future.
Really challenging us with those 20 seconds. I think 2 things. One thing that we're heavily working on is looking at how we can provide access to new markets for social innovators. Right? So how can we create access to B2B markets for social innovators, integrate them into corporate supply chains, and through that increase revenue streams for social innovators. We do that across the globe. We're going to put a lot of effort into that, and we're buckling down on that. And I think that one is going to be really important. The other thing is that we're accelerating and scaling non-financial support to social innovators through a platform which is called Transform Support Hub. And basically, it's a one-stop shop where social innovators can request for non-financial support from corporates. And we're trying to bring as many private sector players into it, so it really becomes a diverse offering. And if any of you are interested in it, please go on it, and we'll be happy to provide pro bono consulting support to you guys to help you with your business models and help you grow your businesses and any other challenges that you might be facing.
Wonderful. And having made personal experience with that, it's a great offer. Thank you, Alex, for bringing that up. Thank you. Rowan.
Starting my 20-second timer now. So one of the things we're excited about at google.org is the potential of AI, right? To transformative impact, open up whole new range of solutions, but also productivity for your venture. So really for us, we're just focused on scaling funding in that space, and got a few different open calls globally. Just launched a 10 million social innovation fund on AI in Europe. And you can go to socialtides.eu if you are in Europe to look at that. That was 30 seconds. Apologies, Matthias.
Wonderful. No, well done. Thank you so much, Alex and Rowan, again, for all the support and your great input. And thank you for everything that you do for the sector and for this global initiative. The saying actually goes that raising a child needs a village. We believe that supporting a change maker needs an ecosystem. And as we've seen today, it's really time to act, which is why through very deep conversations with young changemakers from around the world and members of the Possibilists Alliance and the network partners, we've developed a set of 12 recommendations each, so 48 in total, for key stakeholder groups such as support organizations, funders, policymakers, and young changemakers. And because we always wanted the Possibilists to be far more than just a study, we've designed and created super practical to-do lists for anyone willing to support changemakers out there. You can go onto the website, thepossibilists.org, download these on the website, use them to do a self-assessment, and work through them with your teams, boards, or by yourself.
Thank you, Matthias. Before we wrap things up and share a few more cool practical tools with you we've created, I'd love to ask our 4 speakers on stage again. First of all, I'd like to go with Tanzila. Can you please share with us 1 to 2 recommendations that you have for either one of the group of stakeholders? Thank you.
For sure. Thank you, Mubarak. I would say that a lot of effort is already being put in, a lot of resources are being used, and it'll be a pity if we don't include people who have different abilities, and that applies to, of course, people with physical disabilities and all of the people that are part of this 1 billion number that we have are great resources to all the collaborations, and they're a market as well. And I can, as an entrepreneur, I can say that safely, that I'm happy to pay for a service if it's accessible. So make things accessible for people with disabilities. That would be one recommendation. And the second recommendation would be to become inclusive in the mind, to develop an inclusive mindset. If you're hosting parties, make sure you have vegetarian, vegan options available. That's a start, and that translates into your work, whatever that you're doing.
Thank you for sharing, Tanzila. Charles, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mubarak. I mean, I would like to share my recommendations, right, to fellow change makers, right? And the first one I'd like to talk about is to have rest, right? At every point in time, cultivate the good habit of resting in between your activities, right? Number 2 is to commit yourself to learning and dissemination of impact, right? The funding community or funders community want to fund organizations or projects that are able to demonstrate their impact and also communicate that impact. So invest so much time in impact evaluation, particularly scientific impact evaluation. The third thing is to ensure that you have a network, right? Work in network, network with people that are doing the same kind of work you're doing. And this helps you to not only get motivation, but also look out for support in terms of funding or in terms of pro bono. And the last I'd like to mention about is be accountable, right? Be accountable to yourself, be accountable to the beneficiaries that you're serving, be accountable to your donor community. And at the end of the day, ensure that you find happiness in the work that you do. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. I love your point about accountability, not just to other people, but also to yourself. I think that's really important. Lauren, you have the floor.
Of course. Thank you so much, Mubarak. I would say I have a lot to say about funders since I'm actually pursuing my master's research on the topic, which is super fascinating. I really like the point in the study which talked about giving flexibility to change makers, so giving them multi-year unrestricted funding to implement their ideas and projects, since oftentimes a lot of the funding out there is very project-based, and it also takes a really long time to get approved. Sometimes it takes up to 6 months to receive the funding that you need to make your projects happen. But just having that multi-year unrestricted funding would prevent any unnecessary delays from actually making the change happen. I'd also say it's really important to remove any unnecessary barriers. So, having those burdensome reporting requirements can actually take away from your change-making work. I would also add allowing costs such as overhead, so compensating new change makers is really important. And also removing any eligibility requirements that take away from other underrepresented groups in participating. So I know here in Canada, unfortunately, a lot of the government funding that's out there prevents a lot of international students from getting involved, but that really prevents us from engaging with those communities. So it's just so important to be more open, accessible, and inclusive to these change makers.
Open, accessible, and inclusive. Thank you so much for sharing these key recommendations. Mantaro, please share with us your recommendations. Thank you.
No, thank you. Well, it's a lot of recommendations, but I'll try to synthesize everything. First of all, the main recommendation that I do for policymakers is to reduce the entry barrier for all young activists and change makers all around the world. It's very important for any change maker to have the opportunity to embrace this change maker journey. For example, the place where I come from, I understand the privileges that I was given when I was born specifically by my parents, because first of all, I have a place to sleep. I have a place that has climate condition currently in a city which is having its worst heat wave ever. So, for example, those situations that are perhaps not so important when we have that privilege, it's extremely crucial and important for all the other change makers that are facing hardships in their daily life. And those are the ones we need to bring down the barrier. Examples of barrier, which perhaps I told before, it's the legal barrier entry. It's a tremendous barrier when you are trying to fund yourself, when you're trying to create your social projects, and you cannot even constitute yourself because you don't have the funding for that. And here is my second recommendation: do care for seed funding for all the corporate world, for all the people that can fund social initiatives. Don't be afraid of seed investment. Seed investment doesn't need to have the thousands of dollars. It can be just near hundreds of dollars, but those hundreds of dollars will be enough to start the trickle of change making process. So don't fear the seed funding. I understand all the like all the legal situations, specifically for giving funding to people who are just starting and they're not constituted, and et cetera, et cetera. But let's find a way to give those seed funding to those change makers so they can start change making, so they can start their creative process to give the best solutions to this world.
And that is a perfect way to end the recommendations. Thank you so much, Mantaro. And I want to thank you all so much for giving your recommendations that cuts across, the 4 key group of stakeholders, from funders, policy makers, support organizations, and young change makers. Back to you, Matthias.
Thank you so much, Mubarak. Really inspiring recommendations. We actually do believe that this report is really just the beginning, and that the data is worth little to nothing without real tangible action, which is why we call everyone here today, let's go from data to action. And in order to support you and everyone out there, we've created a minute-by-minute script that anyone can follow to host up to 2-hour sessions with changemakers in their communities, their corporate philanthropy teams, or local ecosystem stakeholders. It guides you through the data step by step and a creative brainstorming process for actions that we can all take to improve the conditions for young changemakers everywhere. We call it the Possibilists Huddles, and they're available for download free of charge on our website right now. Last but not least, we're super excited to share with you that the Possibilists Report 2023 is now live at the Possibilists.org 2023 study. I want to just take a moment to thank everyone massively for their support, the research team at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, Nicole Winchell as the editor of the Key Insights Report, the branding and design team at Rainbow Unicorn, Google.org, and SAP for their support, the layout of the Key Insights Report by Ina Lubis. And changemakers around the world create amazing impact, but they struggle. Each one of us can take some action to help them thrive for their own well-being, but even more importantly, for the good of all. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day and see you soon.